To take an accurate portrait of someone is the most rewarding process. Whether it's the expression, the lighting, the environment, or a combination of everything, the challenge of portraying someone's character and creating a shot that they're truly proud of is something I'll never stop wanting to create. I'm Hannah Couzens, and I've been a professional portrait photographer for the past 18 years. Before we get started with today's tutorial, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the gear that I use, mainly the cameras and the lenses, but also some of the settings and perhaps some of the custom functions that I've enabled just to try to make your workflow a little bit quicker and a bit smoother. So let's start with the camera. Today I'm going to be shooting with the Sony a7R5. Now before that I had an R4 and R3, but the R is for resolution. And the reason that I'm using that in my portrait work is I shoot professionally and commercially, so therefore some of my images I don't know whether they're going to get blown up the size of a bus and on a huge campaign somewhere, so I need that resolution there. However, it doesn't matter if you don't have the same camera as me, you use whatever camera you have. The only thing that may be slightly different is the menu, the appearance of some of the menu systems, but everything is ultimately the same. Now I'm going to be shooting on manual. So all the time I'm going to be shooting on manual so we have full control. Of course, it's up to you if you want to play around with other settings, but I would highly recommend that you really do try and master that manual setting, because you know then you're always in full control of everything and you can see what you're getting straight away. Next, let's talk about lenses and focal length. Now, there's no real hard and fast rules on lens choices when it comes to portraits. However, there's a couple of things that are definitely going to make it more flattering for your subject. First of all, let's talk about focal length. Now, first off, I tend to sort of shoot anything like 50mm and upwards. So 50, 85, 100, 200, that kind of zone, with my favourite being around 85mm. Now, the reason I sort of shoot at this end of the focal range is because it's more flattering for my subject, because we avoid any distortion. Let's say, for example, if I was taking a sort of headshot or waist upwards, let's say, at 50mm, and I was to go quite close in, what will start to happen is that my subject's nose would appear bigger, the features would bend a bit, and the ears would be smaller, and basically it just doesn't look true to life. We don't want to sort of start distorting people's features, so I find 85mm is absolutely the perfect sweet spot to make sure that it's true to life and there's no distortion. The wider focal lengths that you use and the closer you get, the more you're going to notice things just look a bit weird. We bend the features and they just don't look like an accurate portrait. So I would highly recommend sort of sticking to your 50s and upwards if you're going to be shooting fairly close up. Another favourite portrait lens is also the 70-200. The 2.8G master lens is the one I'm going to be using today. But some kind of telephoto is also really handy for portraits, especially sort of shooting outside, because you can really do some interesting things with the compression and shifting the perspective so that it really does change the appearance of what's in front of you to make it look even better. Now, another thing that you might find beneficial is using something called a fast lens. Now, what that will mean is that the maximum aperture available to you will be that much wider. So instead of being stuck around f4, you might go to 2.8, 1.4, 1.2, something like that. Now, the reason they're called fast lenses is because the aperture opens much wider and it allows more light into the frame, so you've got more light available to you if you're shooting in low light conditions. That isn't necessarily a problem for what we will be shooting today. However, it will mean that it's really handy for distorting anything unwanted in the background if we wanted to sort of blur it out and use those real shallow depth of field sort of apertures, so that if we've got some distractions in the background, we can just blur it out. So that's another thing that, although we'll pay for it, it's definitely worth it, because it just means it can get you out of all sorts of trouble and your portraits just look really lovely. It gives such a beautiful depth. It looks great. Now, another thing to discuss is file formats. Do you shoot in JPEG or do you shoot in RAW? Now, I would highly recommend shooting in RAW format. Whilst the file sizes will be much bigger, having that increased flexibility in your post edit is just amazing. I've shot with many different systems across my career and I've never seen anything like the dynamic range on the Sony. This can be especially beneficial if you make a mistake with the exposure or you want to pull down the highlights or pull up the shadows. You have the flexibility to do this with a RAW file, which you just don't get the same results with a JPEG. Now, for me personally, I actually shoot in both JPEG and RAW. Two reasons. One, it's a form of backup for me. It's nice that I can have both. But what I actually do in my workflow is I download all the images from my shoot and I actually resize the JPEGs and upload them straight away to my client. They can pick which ones they want because they're looking at small JPEG files. And then I pull out the RAWs and I edit those from there once they've chosen which ones they want to purchase. You can actually set up your camera so that you have your JPEGs shooting to one card and your RAWs to another. That can sometimes help as well with your workflow. But if all else fails, I really would recommend that you shoot in a RAW format. Next is white balance. Now, as we mentioned, if we are shooting in RAW, then of course we can adjust that afterwards should we make a mistake or feel like we want to change it somehow. But for me, I try to get as much sorted in camera so it's looking good straight off. So therefore, I set my white balance at around 5,500 Kelvin, which is basically daylight. But for me, that works really well when I'm shooting on location and in the studio. And that means that it's a good place to start from. I might want to tweak it afterwards in post, but most of the time I pretty much leave it there and it works really well. Now, there's many different focus modes that work extremely well on these cameras. But for me, with shooting close-up portraits, I tend to shoot with the flexible spot and have it on the medium size. Now, that said, 99% of the time I am using eye autofocus. It's just the best way to go for me. In order for your eye autofocus to work though, we have to set our camera into AFC, and that means it will continuously focus and track your subject. So as they move or as you move, the AFC means it will continuously track it with your eye autofocus and it'll make sure that every single picture is sharp. Now, these Sony cameras are very clever, but it does mean that their menus can be quite extensive. So I find the custom keys invaluable. Now, what this means is I can assign some of these keys on the back of my camera, on the top, some are on the lens. It's entirely up to you how you set it up. But the features that I use most often, I assign to these custom buttons so that I have them at my fingertips so I can turn them on and off very quickly, see the results that I want without having to go deep into the menu. Everything is right at my fingertips. So let's have a look at some of mine and show you what I've got set up, and hopefully that will help you just to speed up your workflow and to keep everything running a bit more smoothly. So I'm just going to show you a couple of things that I've got set up in my custom keys and how I did that. So firstly, we're going to be in the setup menu, then we're going to go across to dial customize. We're then going to go custom key dial set. You can see at the top there that that is for the stills. You can obviously do it for movies as well, but the one we want is for stills. So I'm going to select that. As you can see, there's many different ways that you can customize things by putting them on the wheels, on the lens, all those sorts of things. And the one that I'm looking for is rear one. The reason being, I find this easiest for me personally to navigate, that everything is at my fingertips on the back of the camera. As you can see here, we've got them numbered. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can see that they light up orange depending on which button it is that you're customizing. The two that I want to draw your attention to is number 1. Firstly, I've actually switched out my AEL button for my eye autofocus. For me personally, how I hold the camera, I find that it's a nice place to have it, and then I've got my fingers free to hit the shutter. So how we do that is we would select number 1. Obviously mine are already set up, so it's already, you can see the pathway of how I got there. However, let's go back and show you if you were setting it up yourself. So we're in the the autofocus and the manual focus section. Then we go across to subject recognition, then across again, subject recognition, AF, and just hit select for that. Now you can see that that one, the AEL button, now is assigned for my eye autofocus. The other one that I want to draw your attention to is this one down here, which is our live view display select. Now I've actually got that on my little rubbish bin, my little trash can down there. I find that easiest to sort of toggle on and off when I'm trying to sort of have a look at my display settings and seeing what I'm getting. So again, how we would navigate there is we would select it, we would go into the shooting menu. So we'd be across over here in this menu, then we'd go shooting display, then we go across to live view display select. Select that one. And that means that now that little trash can button enables me to just hit it on and off so I can see my live view display settings. I can see either what's happening when I change the shutter speed in the aperture or not. And we might find, why do you want to not see that? Well, we'll find out later in the tutorial, but that's definitely what we want to turn off when we're working in the studio. You might find that some of your menus are a little different here. I'm working with the A7R5, so the appearance of these may look a little bit different, but generally if you look into the same menus and try and navigate your way around, depending on what you're trying to assign, you will find these things in there somewhere. Finally is the wireless flash function. One thing we'll need to do is enable wireless flash within our menu should we wish to use flash. Now what this allows us to do is to control the flash as soon as we get it on the hot shoe, or indeed if we're using a trigger. The camera by default comes with it turned off and therefore our flash won't fire. So it's crucial that at this point we want to set this up so that we know if we want to pop a flash on or use it off camera, we can enable it now and know that it's going to work. Let's begin with shooting outside. Now this is something that of course is accessible to everyone. You can take pictures like this in your garden, a local park, anywhere you like really. However, there may be a few things that we can do to improve your portraits. Depending on the location, and also for me right now, this time of year, it's not the best to be shooting in. There's no flowers out, there's no colour anywhere, and it just doesn't look the best. So perhaps there might be some bits in my composition here that I need to pay attention to make sure that they don't steal the attention away from my model. Now, how do we do that? So lens choice is crucial here, and this is where these fast lenses, the ones that open up to those apertures of 2.8 f2, 1.4, something like that, will really help, because basically what it means is we can blur any distracting elements in the background and they look less noticeable, again drawing the attention back to our model. Another thing that can be really easy to do when you're shooting portraits is you're so focused on your subject, you forget to look at the background, and we forget our sort of wider landscape of what's around us. And sometimes there may be some things that you don't notice at the time, but when you get back and you look at your pictures, you think, if only I had taken a step to the left or right, it makes a difference. So what I want to do here is show you some different compositions and things to look out for that might just help you next time you're taking your portraits. One thing that will really come into its own here is the eye autofocus. When we're shooting at those wider apertures and really down low so that the backgrounds are all blurry, the last thing we want is for the focus to hit the wrong bit. And by that I mean we don't want it to hit the background or a shoulder. We always want to make sure that our model's eyes are in focus. For me, preferably, I like both eyes in focus. However, what will definitely look better is whichever eye is closest to the camera, we really want that one in focus. Now, the beauty of eye autofocus is that if I was in a rhythm shooting with my model and I wanted to go from left to right, for instance, the eye autofocus tracks the eye nearest the camera. It knows to move and it can see it and it moves for you. So you don't have to think about that and you can concentrate on directing your model. Another thing to consider when it comes to portraits is your lighting. So of course we're outside, so we have to work with what we have. Now, the last thing we want to do is stand our model in direct sunlight where she's squinting and you really don't get a very nice expression. So what we need to do here is combine the background, the distracting elements and the light direction to get the best portraits possible. So now Georgia is here, we're trying to find the final spot as to where to take these shots. Now, we've chosen this particular area because behind where the camera is, there's a car park, there's lots of things that are distracting. Now there is a car park over the other side as well, so I've got to be really careful how I frame. The sun is also coming from behind Georgia, but I'm okay with that. That's fine, that's good, because what it's doing is it's acting like a hair light, like a rim light, just making a bit of separation. What I was initially concerned about perhaps is the darker hair on the darker background of where the big tree is, but having that sunlight just acts as that little separation light works really well. Now what we might want to do here is add in a reflector, because of course the light is coming from behind. So perhaps if we just sort of pop up a white reflector to bounce a little bit of light back into Georgia's face, it might just change the image and bring it to life a little bit. But first things first, we need to drop that aperture and get down to the real shallow 1.4 f2, something like that, and see how we look. Right, so looking through the lens now, down at an aperture of f9, we can see that obviously everything is in focus in the background. You can also see some distracting elements like those cones and the car. So first thing we want to do is open the aperture. So let's open that all the way up to 1.4. Now, of course, that's blown everything out. So we need to compensate by changing our shutter speed. So we'll just bring that down and down and down until we have an exposure that we're looking. I think probably around there is working quite well for me. Now, other things that I was describing earlier, big patches of white in the background. Now this is the sky over here, so that area to the top in the middle doesn't really work for me. If I come this way, I've got the same thing, and of course that is the car and the cone that we saw initially. So my framing has got to be quite careful here, so I'm going to go up a little bit to frame that out. Here you can really see that eye autofocus working. So while we're down at f1.4, you can definitely see that it's only focusing on the eye. Now Georgia, could you just move from your left to your right for me? So just change around. Perfect. So as she's moving, you can see that eye autofocus is tracking her eye. If you were to sort of face your shoulders in the other direction, so turn around sort of like that way, perfect, and then looking back to me, exactly. Brilliant. It's tracking Georgia's eye, the one closest to camera, which is perfect. So even though we're shooting really shallow down at 1.4, I know that Georgia's eye is definitely going to be in focus. Now the other thing we're looking for here is that sunlight. So here we've got it coming in from the back, acting as the hair light. Everything's looking really lovely. We may just bring a reflector in and see the difference. Just into the side of the frame here, we've got it as close as possible. If you just bring that back just a tiny bit so it's not in frame, wonderful. We always want the reflector as close as we possibly can without being in frame. But the nicest thing here is that it's just added a little catch light into Georgia's eye as well, which just makes it come to life just a little bit more. As we said before, the time of year isn't necessarily on our side. So we've got this hedge here where the leaves are actually dried up and are pretty dead. However, it can give some kind of colour if we're clever with it. Now what I've decided to do now is switch to a different kind of lens. I've gone for a telephoto. Here I've got the 70-200 G Master f2.8. Now, there's a couple of things I'm going to do here that's going to help me out. I'm definitely going to be shooting down at 2.8, but I'm actually going to take a few steps backwards and I'm going to shoot at 200 or as close to as I can so that I can compress the scene. And basically what we're doing is just sort of squashing it a bit. So therefore, anything like that depth of field is going to be even more enhanced. And I'm hoping that what looks like some dead leaves, we can just turn into a bit of blurry colour and make for a bit of a more interesting portrait. So, currently my focal length is at 70 and we're at 2.8 here. However, I'm not quite sure about this. I think this could look better. I'm going to take a few steps backwards and zoom. Now by zooming in and refocusing and leaning into the hedge a little more, this is suddenly making for a more interesting portrait. If I lean in even more, there you can see some of those old leaves are just sort of blurring in the background, catching the light. And now that the scene is compressed, it looks even more interesting. Now that we've taken some portraits outside, I thought it would be nice to come into the studio and to take some portraits with flash. Now, flash doesn't need to be scary or intimidating, and don't worry, if you don't have a studio space like this, then you can definitely just rig up some background paper in the corner of a room somewhere. I have done so on many occasions and it will work out just fine. Another thing that's really important when we're shooting in the studio is if you don't want to incorporate any ambient light within the room and we only want to make sure that just the light from the flash is hitting our subject, we need to shut out everything else using our settings to make sure we're not getting any ambient light leaking in from anywhere else. Now, right now I have a video light on me and there's ambient light in the room so I can see what I'm doing. We're not going to shoot in complete darkness. However, we don't want any of these additional lights to be affecting our image in any way. How we ensure that the image would be black is through our settings. So we would basically be shutting down the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO so that our first image would be completely black without the flash on. However, if we were to leave our live preview settings on, we wouldn't be able to see anything. This is where it's really handy to assign a custom key button somewhere close to hand so you can toggle that on and off so that when you do shut down all of those settings to cut out the ambient light, you can still see your model, still see your composition and see what you're doing. Many of you may have a flash at home, could be something like a speed light, and of course the way that we usually start is to put the speed light on the hot shoe on top of the camera. I'm just going to start by showing you a few differences of what that actually looks like with direct flash versus bouncing it versus actually taking it off of the camera. That's always my favourite thing to do. So let's have a look at some examples and show you what that actually looks like in real life. Firstly, let's begin with the flash on the hot shoe, pointing directly at Georgia. As you can see, the results aren't so flattering as we have lots of contrast and very hard shadows. This is due to the fact that the light source is very small compared to our subject. Next, if we angle the flash up towards the ceiling and bounce the flash, as long as the ceiling is white, it will increase the surface area of the light and produce a much softer, flattering light. But for me, the catch light is still a little small and this could be improved. Finally, if we remove the flash from the camera and use something like a softbox or an umbrella, we can position the flash exactly where we want it. This now creates a soft and flattering light as we've increased the size of the light source, but we now have those lovely catch lights back in Georgia's eyes. I've now switched to a different kind of studio light. So rather than a speed light, I've gone to a studio light. This has got a modelling light in it so that I can really turn this up and you can see what I'm doing and where the lights fall in. However, as we said before, we want to make sure that none of the ambient light in the room, including the modelling light, is going to show up when we actually take the shot. So this is where we need to toggle on and off our live preview settings to make sure what we're getting is black. So with the current settings that I have of 1/80th and f2, we can clearly see that there's lots of light hitting Georgia. So what I'm going to do here is increase my shutter speed. I'm going to stay under my camera's flash sync speed, so I'm going to go to 1/160th of a second. But I definitely don't need to shoot this portrait at f2. So I'm going to shut down the aperture, close it down, keep going until I can't see Georgia anymore. So around f8. Now the screen is black. That's going to be perfect because I know that no ambient light in the room is hitting Georgia. However, if I was to try and do a composition and take a picture, I can't see anything. So this is where it's really handy for me to just toggle off my live view display. Then I can see Georgia, I can focus, I can do everything that I need to, but I know that when I take the shot, no other ambient light in the room will be affecting my image. Now with my flash off camera, I can move the position of the light around to create different lighting patterns on the face. Here I have it placed to the right with Georgia facing to the left. This will light most of the face and is referred to as broad lighting. Next, I have the flash positioned higher up and angled down to create what we would call butterfly lighting. I've also asked Georgia to hold a silver reflector to bounce some light back under her chin. Finally, with Georgia still facing to the left, I have moved the light to the same side so the shadows fall forward towards the camera. This creates more of a dramatic portrait and is what we would call short lighting. finally, what we're going to do is combine what we've learned from the first section and the section in the studio. We're actually going to be using a flash outside. Now, it's a simple process. It's not as complicated as you'd think. All we need to do is start as we did at the beginning, which is to establish our base exposure. What I mean by that is we want to dial in our aperture, dial in our shutter speed without any flash to begin with. Then what we're going to do is pop up a flash, put the remote on, put the trigger on, take a test shot in TTL, that's through the lens metering, so it's going to take a little almost automatic setting of how much light it thinks we need based on our composition and our settings, and then if we need to change it from there, we can adjust it up or down in the manual mode. So the first thing we need to do is get an ambient exposure first of Georgia, as if we were shooting just in natural light first. Before I do anything else, I want to establish the composition in camera and get my settings in place for a good ambient exposure. This time, I'm not so worried about the natural light hitting Georgia's face, as I know I'm going to add my flash in the next step. Once again, I'm using the telephoto lens and wide aperture to try to create some colour in this portrait without the detail of the leaves. Next, we bring in our flash. I'm actually positioning this on the same side as the sun, which often confuses people, but it's the best way to create a natural looking light and to avoid any cross shadows. Remember, we are only looking to fill the shadows on the face here, but keep a natural look. If we compare both of these images, the effect is subtle, but the shadows on the face are filled and the catchlight in the eyes just brings the portrait to life. So there you have it, guys. I hope that's been helpful for you and you've picked up a few tips and tricks on how to improve your portraits. Now, one thing I would say is, as much as you can, just try to practice and get your settings and your lights exactly how you want them, so it almost becomes a bit like autopilot. The reason being is that allows you then to concentrate on working with your subject and your model. Now, remember that portraiture is half the technical side of things, but half the expression of your subject. So what I would say is that as much as you can, try to keep relaxed, be clear, and give the best direction as you possibly can. I find what works well for me is that if I want a subject to sort of turn a certain way or move their head in a certain way, I very often do it with them. It's the easiest way for them to see exactly what you want. But I do wish you the very best of luck, and I'm sure you'll create some amazing portraits.